the president and chairman of the board of the Middle East Policy Council. It's my pleasure today to join Kim Ghattas in this contributor dialogue. We will be having a very good discussion of her recent book, Black Wave, which I had the pleasure not only of reading, but of also reviewing for our journal, Middle East Policy. Before we get to our discussion with Kim, I would like to say a few words about the Middle East Policy Council. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan NGO that promotes better understanding between the US and the people of the Middle East. We've been doing this for 40 years. We're based here in Washington, DC, and we have several, we think, very highly impactful programs. Probably most prestigious is our journal, Middle East Policy, with a circulation of over 16,000. It's considered to be the most impactful policy journal on the Middle East. We also do Capitol Hill conferences. We have a Teach Mideast educational program, and we do a number of activities specifically directed to audiences here in DC, on the Hill, and otherwise. So we're very pleased to have all of you join us today. And in particular, Kim, thank you for joining us from Beirut. I hope all is well there. Here in DC, things are calm, although unfortunately we're getting a little bit more back into a COVID environment. I hope you're not having that experience there. Anyway, I do want to say it was really a pleasure to read your book. Much of what you had to say really brought back memories to me because I served for 30 years as a diplomat on and off in the Middle East. So as I read your insights, there were many aha moments of my own experience there. So I enjoyed reading the book, and I certainly enjoyed being able to write a review of the book. To get us launched in our discussion, I just wanted to ask you, what was interesting to me is your basic question in the book is an interesting one and a very simple one. It's really, what happened to us? And I think that's a very good place to start, because from my own experience, having first gone to the region in the late 1970s, to serving there most recently as US Ambassador to Oman from 2009 to 2012, the change and the kind of dynamics that I observed were quite remarkable, and you document them extremely well in your book. You basically begin by focusing on 1979, mainly three events. And I was in Saudi Arabia actually in 1979, and it was interesting to watch these events firsthand. One was the Iranian Revolution. The second was the siege of the mosque in Mecca. And the third was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And I think you're absolutely right to cite those as fundamental changes in the region. And so I'd like to ask if you could just give us your brief overview, starting with those or wherever you feel the appropriate place is to start, and then kind of walk us through what you've seen, what you discovered in your extensive research for this book.
Thanks so much for having me, Richard. It's great to have this conversation with you and with the audience of the Middle East Policy Council. Things in Beirut are rough. The COVID wave and the Omicron wave is of concern here too, but we have so many concerns that it's, the coronavirus issue is kind of in the background. I'm sure a lot of your followers and members and readers know of the issues that Lebanon is facing currently. That's not the topic of our conversation, but in a way it is, because when we think about what happened to us, that question with which I opened the book, it's a question that is being asked very much in Lebanon today, of course, and Lebanon is inscribed in the regional context, and you have the local dynamics that turn Lebanon into what it is today, but it is also part of the regional context, including the tug of war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which continues to this day and plays out in Lebanon, but also in Yemen, in Syria, etc. And so what I try to do with the book is to go back to that pivotal year of 1979, explain why these three events, the Iranian Revolution, the siege of the mosque in Mecca, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in February, November, and then December. Why these three events, which are at the onset not connected, but just happening in the same year, end up being completely intertwined and unleashing dynamics that transform the region in ways that were not immediately obvious, not even within the first decade. And it took me a while to test the thesis because there are so many pivotal years in the region and, you know, in history in general, in America's
For our
history,
viewers,
or Europe's history, that I wanted to really test the thesis of whether 1979 was indeed such a crucial, pivotal year. And what I found was that what made it different was that it was a year where these events happened and there were geopolitical changes. But unlike other pivotal years, which signal the end of a political era or the downfall of a regime or the end of a war, this was more than just geopolitics. This was also cultural. It had a cultural impact. It had a social impact. It had an impact on religion. And that's why these different dynamics were unleashed across the following 40 years. And so I tried to unpack this. I tried to do it in a way that is both deeply researched, but accessible for a wide audience. And I tried to make it relevant all the way up to today. So the final chapters are about the Arab Uprisings. And of course, you have the killing of Jamal Khashoggi in there as well, the Saudi journalist who was killed in Istanbul, murdered in a Saudi consulate in Istanbul.
Yeah, I somehow ended up on mute. No, I think you've outlined that very well. One of the things, of course, I, as an observer, as a diplomat, and as someone in the region during much of that period, witnessed was the unfortunate kind of public perception transformation of the region and peoples in the region as being more extremist, more radical, that was a kind of a widespread phenomenon where it wasn't, but that was the image that was portrayed. You really delved into a lot of the dynamics behind specific activities, such as the Iranian Revolution, such as Saudi Arabia's kind of move towards promoting a more fundamentalist version of Islam in response to that. That has moved on, and there have been some changes, but I'd be interested in your kind of take of how that kind of dynamic got unleashed and then how it's actually now evolving.
So that's a great question, and it's something that I think about a lot today as I look back at what I've written and how much has changed since the book has come out, because I do think that some dynamics are changing. The book mostly looks back, of course. It's a sort of contemporary history. It brings us all the way up to 2018, but I think a lot is changing very rapidly, and I'll get to that in a moment. But when it comes to the social, cultural, religious impact, what I wanted to do with my writing and my research is show how societies were changed by this rise of intolerance that was unleashed by the nascent rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which both started to weaponize religion and sectarian identities to rally people to their camp. And when you start using religion, you start to feed vitriol into people's narrative of the other. And when you start looking at Sunnis, or if you're Sunni looking at Shias as the other, and using derogatory or inflammatory language that leads to intolerance, can lead to violence. And over time, as both sides also brought in more austere conservative readings of Shia Islam and Sunni Islam, into the mainstream, that also led to the rise of cultural intolerance. And that is a sort of a wave that washed over the region slowly. In Iran, of course, the changes were very rapid. Within a year, it had become an Islamic republic, alcohol was banned, museums were closed, women had to veil, and so on. But in Saudi Arabia, even as a very conservative country, some changes were not noticeable only until later. And some people didn't realize that the unleashing of the religious police onto people, which was not as prevalent before 1979, they didn't realize that the forcefulness of the religious police was there to stay. They thought it was temporary, and that's kind of the boiling frog syndrome, where you don't realize that what you're seeing unfolding around you is really there to stay. That's also how people looked at the rise of Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Shia militant group founded with the help of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards from Iran, which set up camp in the Bekaa Valley in eastern Lebanon in 1982. People thought that, it felt very foreign to the Shia community in Lebanon. The rise of the chador, the religious music on the radio the whole time, the black flags flying everywhere. It was foreign to the Shia community at first, to a lot of members of the Shia community and to other Lebanese around them. And they thought it was an exception and that it would end with the civil war, that this was just part of the chaos of the civil war. And then the civil war ended, but Hezbollah continued. And today they are the dominant force in the Shia community. So those are some of the social changes and religious changes that I try to untangle in the book, while at the same time making very clear that intolerance and extremism remain the minority. I'm very keen to make sure that with this book, readers get a much more nuanced version of the Middle East than what we get in the media usually, which is dictators or terrorists, tyrants and terrorists. It's really about bringing in a more diverse view of the region and showing the plurality, the diversity, the tolerance, and the very hard work that a lot of people have put in to push back against what I describe as the Black Wave over the course of the last few decades. Some of them, of course, paying with their life or going to exile. I know the ending is not always rosy, but it's a very diverse region.
Thank you so much, Kim, for those comments. I think we might be having some technical problems. We'll wait just 1 minute while Ambassador Schmier gets reconnected. Actually, while we're waiting, can dive into some specific questions that we had for you as part of this contributor dialogue. The first question was, how do major events of 1979, and you touched on this a little bit so far, such as the Iranian Revolution, the siege of the Holy Mosque in Mecca, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, uniquely answered the question, what happened to us?
So yeah, as I was saying, thank you, Jeremy, for picking up there. I was worried that we'd have internet problems in Lebanon, but it looks like DC is having some issues. So hooray for Beirut.
Yes.
So as I was saying, what I thought was so fascinating about 1979 is how it's different from other pivotal years. You can look at 1967 and the Six-Day War in the Middle East as a key year for the region. You can look at the fall of the Ottoman Empire as the time when the region changed dramatically. But what I found is that, as I said, none of these years had such an impact on society and mostly people's understanding of religion. It didn't change our culture. It didn't change who we are. to the extent that 1979 did. And I think that what's also interesting for people to keep in mind is that the question, what happened to us, with which I opened the book, is a question, as I said, that is being asked a lot in Lebanon today, but with a more forceful perspective, because change in Lebanon over the last couple of years has been very intense and very rapid. It's been kind of a whiplash. And so it's more, if I'm allowed to use a minor expletive, it's more what the hell just happened. It's not what happened to us, but it's, looking back at history, but it's what the hell just happened here. It's the question that people are asking themselves in Hong Kong, for example, or in Afghanistan. But what struck me most is that when I was touring for the book in the US back in 2020, a lot of people were asking me, do you think that the question, what happened to us, is a question we're going to be asking in the US a few years from now? So what I like to try to do also with my writing is to connect issues to other parts of the world and have a more global conversation, and take the Middle East out of this sort of stereotypical box of this is a region where everything is wrong, everything's black, everything's backwards, everything's intolerant. There are some real issues that play out in ways that are more intense here, but they're not uniquely Middle Eastern. And that applies to sectarianism too. I read a lot about Northern Ireland, and sometimes I feel like I'm reading about Lebanon.
Yeah, the connections globally, that was the first thing that came to my mind as an American when you first started speaking, as what some of the connections might be with this country. Kim, one thing that we were interested in was sort of, were there surprises that you had? You did a lot of interviewing for this book about the events of 1979 and about how people's lives were affected. Were there responses that, really surprised you, that stood out to you, that were unexpected, or that moved you in the process of the interviewing?
So I'll say two things. First, I was a little bit surprised by some of the headlines of 1979 that I found, which validated my thesis. But even though I knew that I was kind of on the right track, I didn't expect to see some of those headlines. And one of them was, I think it was March or it was February. It was February 1979. So right after the return of Ayatollah Khomeini and the victory of the revolution. There was a headline in, I believe, a Kuwaiti newspaper in Arabic saying Saudi Arabia lauds the victory of the revolution in Iran. And even though I knew that initially the Saudis let me turn this around. I knew that from my research, I knew that the Saudis and the Iranians were not always rivals, right? That's the whole point of the book. Before 1979, Saudi Arabia and Iran were friendly allies, or friendly competitors. They were twin pillars in US policy in the region to contain the Soviet Union. So there was no enmity there. There was some friendly competition, as you have between big countries. And then I knew that they were sad to see the Shah go, because he was their friend, and they were mostly concerned about the possibility that he would be replaced by a Soviet regime. And so to see that headline, that they welcomed the success of the revolution, confirmed two things. It confirmed that Iran and Saudi Arabia were not enemies, because they could they felt comfortable enough that they could welcome the choice of the people. If the people of Iran didn't want the Shah anymore, then so be it. That was their.
Like, we have a slight technical problem here with him breathing. So if our viewers could just sit tight for just a few seconds, she should return very soon. We apologize for the technical inconvenience.
Jeremy, while we wait, let me just mention that was able to read the book and read it in hardcover, but it has just come out in paperback. It is a bestseller, and so I want to congratulate you, Kim, on that. And I
jinxed myself with cheering for Beirut's internet, but I'm back.
I'm having internet problems too. But anyway, I did want to mention, as I mentioned at the outset, I really enjoyed not only reading your book, but writing a review, because it brought back for me so many memories of my time there. Before, I did have one question from my review, which I'll read in a moment, but I did have one other question, and I welcome your insights. When I was in Oman as ambassador, we worked very closely with the Omanis to engage the Iranians. And I think successfully. President Obama, Hillary Clinton came a couple of times. He spoke with the Sultan regularly. And I think we successfully conveyed to the Iranians at that time, under the Obama administration, that we were not going to take sides in the Sunni-Shia dispute. We were not seeking regime change in Iran. And we wanted to help work with Iran to get Iran to come back into the international community. Unfortunately, my assessment of that is that the Iranians failed to take advantage of that opening. And I've asked myself, why? Was it for domestic political reasons? Is it because they actually feel they have a stronger hand in the region than we feel they do? And I think it would be good for the region if Iran would take advantage of the opportunity that not only we, but I think our partners in the region were offering them to return as players and, have good relations in the region. That hasn't happened. I hope it might still happen, but I'd be curious to hear your views as to why would Iran not have taken advantage of that? And do you think the day may come that they will?
I have to say I'm not optimistic, because I think the Iranian regime, and even more so under President Raisi, thrives on enmity with the West. That's their raison d'etre, that's their mode of survival. And even though they are, feeling the pressure at the moment, they're also doing reasonably well in terms of maintaining their hold on power and allies and proxies in the region. So they have influence in Lebanon, they have influence in Syria, they have influence in Yemen. I don't see them giving that up in exchange for better relations with the US. I think we often see the enemy or the foe or the counterpart from a rational Western, well, I don't want to say rational Western perspective, but from a sort of constructive perspective, a can-do American perspective. And I remember a conversation with, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. I believe it was in 2008. Putin just invaded Georgia. And she said, I was interviewing her. I hope I'm getting my facts right, but 2008, it was Georgia. And I was interviewing her about, how was the US going to push back against that? And she said, well, if Putin wants to be an actor on the international scene and part of the international community, if he wants to be part of the WTO and so on, he can't do these things. And my answer, maybe because I have a different perspective from this region, having grown up here and lived here, I can see how actors like Putin and Bashar al-Assad or the Iranians are saying, well, we don't like your system. We can create our system. And in many ways, that's kind of what we're seeing today, this sort of league of authoritarian countries that are banding together, the Russians and the Chinese, and they're cozying up to some countries in the Middle East. It's the same question we ask about Bashar al-Assad. I remember also a conversation with a State Department official at the very beginning of the uprising in Syria, which was civilian, which was peaceful. And I said, look, Bashar al-Assad is going to burn down the country before he gives it up. And the response I got was, who would do that to their own country? I said, well, you just watch. So I think we have to accept that sitting on top of a pile of rubble but being victorious is okay for some leaders. And I think that, when it comes to the Iranians, they don't want to sit on top of the Iranian regime. I'm not saying they want to sit on top of a pile of rubble, but it's okay if there's rubble elsewhere. I don't see a constructive, positive impact of the Iranian project in the region, not in Lebanon, not in Syria, not in Iraq, not in Yemen. I don't understand what their vision is other than having this forward base as a defense mechanism for their regime survival. That's how they're using the region. And it is very much, as you say, about survival.
No, I agree with you. I came to the same conclusion when they failed to take advantage of what was clearly an opportunity to rejoin the international community. They prioritized what I guess they see as a forward defense against others in the region, which I think is unfortunate. But let me ask you now, let's cross the Gulf. The one country that has changed is Saudi Arabia. I was there before it started its, promoting the more extreme version of Islam. We've had 40 years of that or so, but now under the new leadership, they really are changing that approach. Do you think, I welcome it. I think the people of the region welcome it. How do you see that going? Do you think that will actually fundamentally change Saudi Arabia's engagement and its ability to operate in the region and beyond?
So I make 3 points here. One, I think both Iran and Saudi Arabia have realized that religion and sectarianism are no longer useful tools to rally the masses. The younger generation is not interested. So the black wave that I describe in the book, which is built on the use of religion as a tool, I think that has ended. The rivalry has not ended. It's still there, but it's using tools like populism and nationalism to rally the masses, and that applies to both Saudi Arabia and Iran. When it comes to Saudi Arabia itself, yes, there are great changes within the kingdom, and I think that as we find ways to make sure that Mohammed bin Salman or those around him are held accountable to some extent, to the extent possible that is possible in realpolitik, for the war in Yemen or the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, that we also take into consideration that there are dramatic changes within Saudi Arabia itself that are welcomed by the younger generation, who have wanted and craved this openness to the outside world, this ability to, have, even basic entertainment, the opportunity to go to conferences or concerts or the cinema. I mean, it sounds very basic, but it's something that young people crave. And you could call it smoke and mirrors, and perhaps at the onset it was, but I think it does produce a deeper change within society. But the last point I'll make here is that Mohammed bin Salman also has to be very careful how he handles this, because what eventually brought down the Shah in Iran in 1979 was too much westernization, too rapidly, promising too much but not delivering, and also continuing with oppressive measures to silence dissent. So, is Mohammed bin Salman going to face a backlash to this, opening the floodgates to every single type of entertainment that the younger generation wants? And of course, it's not just about entertainment, because it's really it was a huge development that women in Saudi Arabia were allowed to drive. Employment of women, conferences on AIDS, all sorts of things. I mean, Riyadh is really booming, as some people have told me recently. I haven't been for a couple of years. And I think that's a story that should be told. And I think it's important to recognize the sea change that this represents for young Saudis and for Saudis in general. That does not mean that we should turn a blind eye to the continued jailing of women and activists and other kinds of oppressive measures within the kingdom, and Saudi Arabia's continued role in the war, or leadership of the war in Yemen. As much as they try to get out of that war, they don't seem to be able to.
Absolutely. In addition, there are takeaways here for US policymakers. I'd love to hear, as we sort of move towards the end of this conversation, whether you have any key takeaways or learnings from the book, from your research, that would be relevant to US policymakers, many of whom will be watching this conversation and hopefully reading your book as well.
I think that one of the key messages that I try to drive when I speak to put out, the key message that I try to put out when I speak to policymakers in the US, but also in the region, is to make clear that there needs to be a balance in how the US approaches Iran and Saudi Arabia. You know, we've seen a bit of a lurch from one to the other in the last decade or so under President Obama and then President Trump. It used to be that, you know, Iran was, and I'm simplifying a little bit, Iran was all bad and Saudi Arabia was America's best friend forever. And that meant Saudi Arabia got away with a lot of things that shouldn't get away with. But it was okay because it was America's best friend in sort of this sort of standoff with Iran. President Obama tried to rectify that by opening up to Iran, going into the nuclear deal, trying to reduce America's military posture in the region and America's, you know, footprint in general, and was hoping that Iran and Saudi Arabia would find a way forward together. But in doing so, he did not do enough work to include Gulf countries in the conversation, with the result that they felt excluded, stabbed in the back, and they kind of went overboard in their overreaction to President Obama's moves towards Iran. You know, it was a bit hyperbolic, but they thought, you know, now Iran is going to be America's best friend and we're going to be left behind. That was not going to happen, but that's how they perceived it. And in reaction to that, you had the war in Yemen, you had, you know, various other brazen or petulant moves by the Saudis. Then you get President Trump, and he goes all the way to the other side again. You know, Iran bad, Saudi Arabia great, Mohammed bin Salman, I saved his behind, you know, he could get away with everything, as he was quoted in that book. And that emboldened also Mohammed bin Salman. The maximum pressure on Iran was a counter to what President Obama had been doing. It did push Iran into a very difficult corner, but maximum pressure on its own doesn't deliver any results. It's not like the Iranians are going to kneel and say, okay, we give up. So this sort of lurch from one to the other is where, you know, President Biden picked up. And I think what this administration is trying to do, which is wise but difficult, is to try to find a better balance in how they approach the Saudis and how they deal with the Iranians, trying to include the Gulf countries in their conversations about the region, about Iran's role, keep them, you know, updated, as Jake Sullivan said, no surprises. And in parallel, you see that they're not just simply rushing back into the JCPOA, a nuclear deal at all cost. We just want the deal and we'll lift the sanctions. They're getting a lot of criticism for that. But, you know, I think that's a wiser, more balanced approach.
Okay, well, thank you. I think we are running a little bit out of time. By the way, before I forget to mention, I do enjoy reading your articles in The Atlantic. I'm a voracious reader of
Thank you.
You have some great material there. And also your appearances here in DC through the think tank community. So I want to encourage you to keep your voice live there. I'm sure you will. If I may, let me just finish by reading a little bit from the review that I did, and then it ends with sort of a question. From my own experience living and working in the region over many decades, I would assert that Sunni Shia animosity and sectarianism do not reflect the feelings and beliefs of those who comprise the bulk of the Muslim communities in the Middle East. Rather, the emergence of such attitudes derived from efforts by political leaders who sought to benefit from stoking such sentiments. I am confident that Ghattas would agree with me. On the book's final page, she writes, before it was weaponized in the years following 1979, the Sunni Shia schism lay mostly dormant. So I would be interested in have you, with your final words on the sort of the big picture issue, the big picture theme of your book on the Sunni Shia issue. Do you think we can get to the point where that, when I served in Baghdad and there were Sunnis and Shias and Kurds, there was no animosity among them. They all were part of a community, part of the same society. Do you think we can get back to that? Do you think that's something the region can hope to attain?
Yes, I think that is something we can hope to attain. I think it's something that is underway already to some extent. I think the rise of ISIS was a paroxysm of sectarian violence on all sides, and it made everybody step back from the brink. As I said, I think sectarian identities and religion in general are not as relevant anymore to the younger population. And so I think we're moving away from the bad years of 2003 and 2007 and Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi and all of that and ISIS, etc. But some of this will remain sort of here and there in communities, and you'll see it pop up every now and then because, just look at Northern Ireland. To this day, Catholics and Protestants don't go to school together. And that's in the middle of Europe. So I think some of this is hard to overcome completely, but I think we've left behind the worst of it.
Great to hear.
I wonder whether we've lost Richard again.
I think it was
this
one
has
of
been
those
a technical
days.
challenge, but I think we got there.
I think we got there, and I think the substance of the conversation rose above the technical efforts to convert it. I want to thank you so much, Kim Ghattas, for joining us on this technically challenged Thursday. This was a fascinating conversation. To all of our viewers, a video from this contributor dialogue will be posted on our website at mepc.org, as well as at the Middle East Policy Council's YouTube channel, where this event has been streamed live. So until our next contributor dialogue, we thank everyone, especially Kim Ghattas, for joining us, and we wish all of our viewers a very happy New Year.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Richard.